He saw her standing on the auction block, trembling under the sun like a forbidden promise the law had no right to touch. The crowd pressed closer, boots grinding dust into the ground as if trying to bury any trace of hesitation. Red Hollow had never been ashamed of its appetites. Men came to this outlaw town to drink, gamble, and buy whatever their conscience could not live with. Today, the item on display was not a horse or a gun. It was a young black girl with wrists bound in iron, her breath shallow and uneven, her bare shoulders catching the light like liquid bronze. She stood tall, though the ropes allowed only the illusion of freedom, and her eyes held the quiet fury of someone who had learned that hope was a dangerous thing. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some men smirked, others looked impatient, and a few shifted uncomfortably, as though staring at beauty wrapped in chains forced them to confront something ugly in themselves. Ira did not look at them. Her gaze hovered somewhere beyond the saloon roofs, as if she had left her soul in the horizon and only her body had been dragged here. Her lips were parted just enough to let air slip inside, and her skin glistened with a sheen that had nothing to do with sweat and everything to do with panic. The sheriff hit the podium with his hammer and announced that the auction would begin. His voice pretended neutrality, but his eyes betrayed greed. Ira had been sold before, returned, inspected, evaluated like livestock, and sent back because her previous buyer claimed she was more trouble than she was worth. The lie crumbled as soon as anyone looked at her. Trouble was not the problem. Desire was. She was too beautiful for men who feared what beauty could make them want. The bidding started low. Voices rose. A gambler from the northern mines offered a handful of silver. A rancher raised the stakes with a bag of corn. Laughter followed every price, a cruel sort of entertainment that fed off her silence. I did not flinch when someone whistled at her legs or when another man swore he could break her spirit in a week. Instead, she closed her eyes for a heartbeat and let her breath collect like a prayer she dared not speak aloud. Even bound, she exuded a sensuality that frightened the weak and intrigued the damned. Her stillness was not submission. It was defiance dressed in quiet. The sheriff prepared to end the auction when a shadow fell across the square. Horses shuffled, men turned, and conversations died mid-sentence. A lone cowboy approached, each step unhurried yet deliberate. His coat trailed dust, and his hat shielded his face, but everyone knew him before he stopped moving. No one forgot a man who spoke with his presence instead of his voice. The silent one had returned to town. He did not look at the sheriff. He did not greet the crowd. His eyes found Ira instantly, as though he had ridden across counties just to locate the thing he had lost long ago. Something in his body changed when he saw her, a stillness settling over his broad frame. It was not lust, though it flickered in the air like heat off a forge. It was something deeper, heavier, the recognition of a wound mirrored in another soul. The sheriff cleared his throat and sarcastically asked if the cowboy wished to place a bid. The crowd watched, expecting mockery. Instead, the cowboy reached for something inside his coat. He unfolded a deed, edges frayed and worn by years of hardship. It was not a token. It was everything he owned. His land, his cattle, his home. He placed it before the sheriff, his voice low enough to make the hairs rise on every man's neck. My ranch. Gasps rippled. No one offered more. No one dared. The silent one did not gamble. If he bid, he meant it. Ira's eyes widened for the first time. Her breath hitched, not from fear but from confusion. No one had ever sacrificed anything for her. Certainly not everything. The moment stretched, filled with questions that hung in the heat like invisible nooses. Why would a man give his entire world for a girl he had never spoken to? What did he see when he looked at her? Was she salvation or memory or something dangerously close to desire? The hammer struck wood. The sheriff declared the girl sold. A murmur rolled through the crowd, but the cowboy did not move. He looked at Ira the way a starving man looks at a flame that might burn him yet save him. She shivered beneath his gaze, not because she feared him, but because for the first time in her life, someone looked at her as though she was not a possession to be taken but a secret worth losing everything for. And in that breathless silence, the world changed. The sheriff handed Ira over without ceremony, as if transferring livestock instead of a living soul. The crowd dispersed, boots scattering dust across the square, and only the cowboy remained. He did not touch her at first. He simply stood near her, close enough for her to feel his presence, yet far enough that she understood she could move if she wished. No one had ever given her space before. Space had always belonged to others, claimed by hands that dragged her, voices that ordered her, doors that closed before she reached them. The idea that someone might offer it freely unsettled her more than any lash she had ever received. The cowboy gestured toward his horse, and Ira hesitated. She expected the command to come next, sharp and cold like every order she had known since childhood. Instead, silence met her, a silence that trembled with possibility. She climbed onto the horse slowly, waiting for him to shove her forward or grab her waist. His hand rose, but not to force. He offered it as support, palm open, waiting for her permission. Her fingers touched his briefly. The warmth shocked her. His skin was rough from work, yet softer than she imagined a man like him could be. They rode beyond the town's borders where the land stretched wide and empty. Ira felt exposed beneath the endless sky, as though the world finally saw her, not as a commodity but as a person who could either stay or run. Memories clawed at her chest. She had been taken from her family when she was barely old enough to remember her mother's voice. Her father's arms had been the first prison she knew, not because they hurt her, but because letting go meant losing the last place she belonged. Once sold, she became an object traded between men who believed ownership was the same as love. The first man who bought her had called her a gift from God, then cursed her when she refused to smile. The second tried to mold her into a perfect decoration for his guests, expecting obedience like a dance she did not know how to perform. The third thought silence was defiance and punished her for every breath she took too slowly. None of them cared about her hunger, her exhaustion, or the terror she carried like a second heartbeat. They punished her not because she disobeyed, but because her existence reminded them of desires they wished they did not have. Ira learned early that beauty was a sentence. Her skin drew eyes before she understood what eyes could take. The curve of her hips, once a simple fact of her growing body, became an accusation. The fullness of her lips, a reason for men to imagine she owed them pleasure. She had not chosen the body she lived in, yet every man she met acted as though she created it to tempt them. She wanted to claw her way out of herself just to be free of the gaze that followed her. The cowboy noticed her trembling as the horse carried them along a narrow trail. He rode beside her rather than in front, giving her no direction she did not choose. His silence unnerved her. Men spoke to claim. Men used words like keys to lock women into roles they never agreed to. But this man spoke nothing, and that nothing was louder than any command. She could feel him watching her, yet the gaze held no hunger. It held recognition, as though he saw the weight she carried and understood its shape. They stopped by a creek where the water shimmered like melted glass. Ira slid off the horse and stepped back, expecting him to corner her. Instead, he walked to the water's edge and removed his gloves. His movements were unhurried. He did not ask her to come closer. He dipped his hands into the stream, washed away the dust, and looked at her reflection in the water rather than her body. It was the first time she had seen herself without flinching. The cowboy tilted his head as if silently asking whether she recognized the woman staring back. Her throat tightened. She wanted to look away, yet something in his presence anchored her. He crouched beside the creek and let the wind play with the strands of hair that escaped beneath her headscarf. His fingers hovered near her cheek but never touched. That distance felt erotic in a way that frightened her, not because he wanted her, but because for the first time, someone seemed capable of wanting her gently. The idea that someone might desire her without owning her shook her foundation. A soft sound escaped her, half sigh and half confession. She did not speak, yet her body told truths her voice never dared. The cowboy's eyes softened, reflecting a language she knew without learning. She was not a curse. She was not disposable. She was not a burden carved into a woman's shape. She was someone worth slowing down for. And that terrified her more than any chain ever had. The journey to the ranch took the rest of the evening. The sky darkened into a velvet hush, and the moon rose like a lantern suspended over a world that pretended not to see what men did in its shadows. Ira expected the cowboy to grow impatient the slower she walked, yet he never rushed her. He matched her pace with an ease that suggested he had all the time a wounded soul might need. The contradiction unsettled her. This was a man whose name drifted through saloons like a warning, a man children were told would appear if they lied or stole. The Silent One. He was a legend wrapped in menace, and yet, beside her, he moved like someone terrified of startling a bird. At the ranch, he dismounted first and helped her down with a hand so careful she wondered if he feared she might crumble under his touch. She waited for him to command her inside, but he stepped back and let her choose. The door stood open, warm light spilling through as if the house itself beckoned her. Ira stepped in cautiously. She had been inside many homes before, but none that greeted her without calculating her worth. The scent of wood smoke drifted through the room, mingling with something softer, something that reminded her of mornings she barely remembered. Her shackles clinked with every movement. She looked down, ashamed, expecting him to use the chains as leverage. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced a key. His fingers brushed her wrists as he unlocked the irons. The metal fell away with a sound that startled her more than any shout ever had. She had forgotten what skin felt like without restraint. His fingertips lingered for a moment, not grasping, simply confirming she was real. Ira's breath caught, and her pulse thudded against the places the shackles had bruised. Rumor said the cowboy once killed a man for stepping too close to him. Yet here he stood, close enough that Ira could feel the warmth rising through his shirt. Something in his eyes flickered with a tenderness she did not know how to answer. She took a step back, expecting anger, but he only nodded as though he understood that freedom required distance before it invited closeness. He walked to the kitchen counter and ladled food into a bowl. The smell of cooked vegetables and smoked meat filled the room, and Ira realized she had not eaten properly in days. Her fingers trembled as he handed her the bowl. She hesitated, waiting for the catch. There was always a catch. Men fed her only when they wanted something afterward. But the cowboy stepped away and leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching her without hunger. He did not touch his own bowl until she tasted hers. The gesture unsettled her more than anything else. He fed her first. No man ever had. She took a bite, and warmth spread through her chest, so unexpected she felt tears threaten to escape. She swallowed hard, trying to hide her reaction. The cowboy did not comment. He ate quietly, his movements slow, deliberate, like someone accustomed to controlling every impulse. Ira could not reconcile this gentle creature with the legend of the killer. Men spoke of him as if he were a storm. Here he resembled a man terrified of lightning. Her gaze drifted over him. His coat was worn, his hands calloused, his shoulders broad enough to bear burdens she could not name. His silence pressed against her like an invitation she did not know how to answer. When she finished eating, he took the bowl from her without brushing her fingers, though she noticed the tiny hesitation in his hand as if he almost wanted to. She sat near the fire, the warmth licking her skin. The cowboy lowered himself to the floor, keeping a respectful distance. The flames flickered along the curve of her neck, illuminating her profile. If he were like other men, his eyes would have devoured her. But his gaze lingered with something achingly different. It felt as though he was memorizing her existence, not claiming it. I could not understand how a man who carried death so easily could cradle silence so tenderly. She had seen fear in men before, fear of losing control, fear of hunger that could not be named. But this man's fear was peculiar. He seemed afraid of her fragility, as if one careless word might shatter something precious. He finally looked away, jaw clenched, shoulders tense. She wondered if touching her would burn him. She wondered if he wanted to. The contradiction twisted inside her like a mystery waiting to be solved. If he had killed for less, why did he now behave as though breaking her would break him too? The question hung in the room like smoke. Neither dared breathe it aloud. The ranch seemed to breathe differently in the mornings. Dew clung to the grass like tiny diamonds, and the sun slid slowly over the hills, as if reluctant to disturb whatever fragile peace had settled in the night. Ira woke with the uneasy sensation that the world here was waiting for her to decide whether she believed in it. She moved through the house carefully, half expecting the cowboy to appear behind her with orders or demands, yet he remained at a distance, watching her the way a man watches a wild creature he hopes will not bolt. He found her near the stables that afternoon. Horses stamped and snorted, their bodies gleaming with power she felt unworthy to approach. The cowboy stood beside a chestnut mare, his hands stroking the animal's mane. He did not speak, but something in his stance invited her closer. She stepped forward, hesitantly at first, then with more courage when she realized the horse did not recoil. The cowboy extended the reins, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. Her heart lurched, not from fear but from the strange warmth that surged through her hand. He guided her foot into the stirrup and helped her mount. His touch remained steady and sure. Her breath hitched. She pressed her forehead against the door, fighting the urge to pry it open. The idea that her name, something stolen and reshaped by men who owned her body but never earned her story, existed here without permission made her knees weaken. She stepped away when she heard the cowboy return. Her pulse raced, equal parts curiosity and fear. Had he known her before she arrived, or had someone else once carried her name through these walls? Later that evening, she walked into the main room and found him standing near the fireplace. He held something wrapped in cloth. When he saw her, he flinched, almost guilty. He folded the item quickly and hid it behind an old trunk. Ray lingered near the door, waiting for him to speak. He did not. Silence pulsed between them, thick with secrets. She pretended not to notice, but her eyes had already caught a glimpse of what he concealed. A portrait. The face of a woman. A woman whose dark skin shimmered like hers. A woman whose eyes held a tenderness Ira recognized too easily. A woman who might explain everything he refused to say. Whispers in town began to drift back to her. The trader who delivered supplies muttered that the cowboy had not always lived alone. The bartender at the saloon swore he had once seen him laugh, back when he rode with a woman who made even thieves pause to admire her. Someone else claimed she had died suddenly, leaving him with a grief no bullet could kill. Ray listened without asking for details, her heart twisting with the possibility that her resemblance to the woman in the portrait was no accident. The cowboy behaved differently now, more cautious, as if he feared every glance between them might reveal something he was not ready to confront. Each kindness he offered felt like a piece of a puzzle she had not been given permission to solve. Every answer he gave only deepened the mystery, leaving her suspended between belonging and exile. The ranch was no longer a refuge. It had become a question. She did not know if she was living inside a ghost's memory or being woven into a story she did not yet understand. And that question, more than anything else, kept her awake at night. The first sign that peace was an illusion came with the sound of hooves. Ray heard them before she saw anything, the thunderous rhythm of horses driving the stillness from the land. She stood in the yard, hands pressed to the railing of the porch, and watched dust rise on the horizon. The cowboy stepped outside moments later, his posture rigid, eyes narrowed at the trail the riders carved into the earth. He did not need to speak for Ira to understand. Whatever he feared had finally found its way to his door. For men emerged through the dust, their faces twisted with the smugness of entitlement. Ira recognized two from the auction, men who had laughed when her price was called, men who had bid on her like she was a tool they could sharpen to suit their darkest impulses. The sheriff rode with them, his badge glinting like a lie pinned to his chest. None of them should have been here. The sale was legal, the deed was signed, yet they approached as if ownership were theirs to reclaim whenever whim struck. The sheriff dismounted and stepped forward, a folded paper in his hand. His voice carried across the yard, confident and oily, announcing that the cowboy had violated county law by purchasing stolen property. According to the document, Ira was still bound to the men who had first taken her, and therefore the sale was invalid. Ira's breath caught in her throat. She had known freedom would not come cleanly, but she had not expected the law itself to morph into her chains. The cowboy did not flinch. He walked down the steps and stood beside her, his presence steady and immovable. The sheriff extended the paper, a warrant signed by a judge whose reputation was darker than any saloon rumor. The cowboy did not bother reading it. He knew corruption when he smelled it. The sheriff smirked, delighted by the tension. He claimed Ira was property, not person, and that taking her from the auction had been theft. The men behind him laughed, their eyes sliding over Ira's body with the same hunger she had fought her whole life. Her knees trembled, but she did not move. Fear crawled up her spine, the old terror whispering that she should flee before they dragged her away again. Running had been her only weapon for years. Yet something within her resisted the instinct. She glanced at the cowboy and found no command in his gaze, only a question. Would she stand with him, or would she surrender to the fate others had written for her? The sheriff stepped closer, his voice dripping with condescension, telling her she could avoid punishment if she returned willingly. He promised a roof, food, and work in exchange for her compliance. His words pressed against her like a suffocating hand. Ira felt her heart hammering, but she straightened her shoulders. She saw the truth in the man's eyes. He did not promise safety. He promised possession. The cowboy moved slightly, positioning himself at her side rather than in front of her. It was not a shield. It was a vow. He was not hiding her. He was choosing her. She felt heat gather beneath her ribs, not from fear but from anger. Her voice emerged before she had time to doubt it. She told the sheriff she was not going anywhere. The sound startled everyone. Ira had been silent for so long that even she had forgotten how conviction tasted. The sheriff's expression darkened. He waved his hand, and one of the men reached for her arm. The cowboy's hand dropped to his holster with such calm precision that the intruder froze before making contact. The yard grew quiet. Birds ceased singing. Wind held its breath. The men searched the cowboy's eyes and found no hesitation. They saw someone who had already lost everything once and was prepared to lose it again if it meant protecting what remained. The sheriff hissed that the cowboy could not win. The law was on their side. The cowboy answered with a single sentence, spoken softly yet carrying the weight of a breaking world. He said that any law willing to own a woman was already dead. The words left the sheriff momentarily speechless. In that silence, Ira realized the cowboy was not saving her. He was standing with her. The difference lodged itself inside her heart like a spark begging for flame. The sheriff mounted his horse with a promise to return with more men and more paperwork. The riders retreated, but their departure felt like a storm gathering at the horizon rather than an end. Ira watched them disappear and knew her life would never be the same. She no longer feared the men who wanted to claim her. The terror she once carried had fermented into resolve. The cowboy did not look at her like someone he rescued. He looked at her like someone he chose, and that choice gave her the courage to finally choose herself. The threat had arrived, but so had something far more dangerous. Ira had stopped running. Dawn never truly broke the next morning. The light rose timidly, smothered by clouds so dense they seemed to press against the sky. Silence wrapped the ranch in a tension that prickled Ira's skin. She stood on the porch, watching the horizon with her knees curling inside her like smoke. The cowboy moved through the yard with deliberate calm, checking the gates, loading ammunition, moving as though the world had already delivered its verdict and he was merely preparing to answer it. His silence no longer frightened her. It steadied her, like a heartbeat she could follow through darkness. The first shot cracked through the air before Ira could breathe. Horses shrieked and reared as figures emerged from behind the hills. Dust spiraled beneath hooves, and the men who claimed ownership of her thundered toward the ranch with fury twisting their faces. The sheriff rode at the head, his eyes narrowed with vindictive certainty. The law was on his tongue, but murder burned in his gaze. Ira's chest clenched as bullets tore through the wooden fence, splinters flying like sharp reminders of everything she had. The cowboy stepped beside her, rifle already raised, his body poised in a stance that spoke of violence woven into his bones. His voice was barely louder than the wind as he told her to get inside, not as a command, but as a plea. She shook her head. The fury in the sheriff's gaze made it clear that running would change nothing. If she hid, they would burn the world down just to drag her out again. She turned and sprinted into the house, but not to escape. She went to arm herself. Her fingers trembled as she reached for a rifle she had seen resting near the mantel weeks earlier. It was heavier than she expected, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if she had the strength to lift it, let alone fire it. The image of the cowboy standing alone outside flashed before her, and something fierce took root inside her chest. He was the first person who had ever looked at her without expectation or hunger, the first to offer food without a price, freedom without a condition, and space without a threat. She had been treated as property her entire life, a thing to own and tame, and here stood a man prepared to lose everything rather than let her be taken again. She stepped back outside, the rifle pressed against her chest. The cowboy turned, eyes widening when he saw her. Bullets slammed into the barn behind them, and horses screamed as chaos ripped through the air. He tried to speak, but the sheriff shouted over him, accusing him of stealing what did not belong to him. The cowboy barked a warning, voice low and thunderous, telling them to leave before he turned the soil red. Ere lifted her rifle with shaking hands, aiming it at the men who intended to reclaim her body and crush her spirit. She did not pull the trigger, but the act of holding it changed something in her. She was no longer prey. She was present, a force in her own story. The sheriff spat her name like poison and fired again. The bullet grazed the porch rail, splintering wood. The cowboy stepped in front of her, shielding her with his body. His voice broke through the roar of gunfire, rough and desperate, something she had never heard from him before. He called her by name, a sound so full of emotion it made her knees weaken. Under fire, he confessed the truth he had locked behind silence. He said she resembled his wife, a woman whose beauty matched her courage, a woman who dared to love him openly despite the hatred it sparked. He said she was murdered because men could not stand to see a black woman cherished. He said he had lost everything the day she died, everything except the memory of how she deserved to live. His eyes locked onto Ira's, and she saw grief, longing, and something dangerously close to hope. He told her he had not saved her because she was broken. He saved her because she reminded him of the life his wife never received. She deserved a future untainted by men who measured worth in chains and obedience. Thunder rolled as bullets shattered the porch steps, but Uri stood her ground, her breath shaking with the weight of his words. In that moment, the world narrowed to two hearts refusing to bow. Whether death came from bullets or memory did not matter. What mattered was that for the first time, she was not something to be owned. She was someone worth fighting for. The gunfire eventually faded into the distance, and the dust settled over the ranch like a heavy sigh. The sheriff and his men retreated under the weight of their own defeat, leaving behind broken boards, shattered glass, and a silence that trembled with everything that could have been lost. Ure and the cowboy stood together amid the wreckage, their bodies still humming with adrenaline, their breaths uneven as if their lungs had forgotten how to rest. The battle was over, but the echoes of it whispered through the air like ghosts unwilling to leave. Word spread quickly. Townsfolk who once looked away began to murmur about the warrant, the lies, and the judge who had signed it. Whispers became questions, and questions turned into outrage. The judge's reputation crumbled as the truth bared its teeth. Documents were uncovered, testimonies were forced into daylight, and the judge stood exposed as a man who sold justice like cattle. Ira watched from a distance as men who once mocked her now stared at her with shame, trying to decide whether to apologize or pretend ignorance. She let them linger in their confusion. They had never earned her forgiveness. The ranch, though scarred, still stood. The house bore bullet holes and splintered beams, the barn leaned as if exhausted by survival, and the fence looked like a ribcage barely holding the heart of the land together. Yet, beneath the destruction, something pulsed with stubborn life. Ira felt it every time her bare feet brushed the soil. The land did not reject her. It welcomed her with a quiet promise she had never heard before. She woke early one morning, gathered seeds she found in an old drawer, and walked to the gate where men once came to drag her away. The memory of terror hovered there, yet her hands did not tremble. She knelt in the dirt and pressed the seeds into the earth. Each one felt like a declaration. She was not planting flowers. She was planting permanence. The petals would bloom where fear had once ruled, roots would claim the land that once tried to expel her, and color would settle into a place where violence had screamed. Her fingertips sank into the soil, warm and alive, and for the first time, she understood that healing was not about forgetting. It was about growing where the wound once bled. The cowboy watched her from the porch, hammer in hand. He had begun repairing the house quietly, board by board, nail by nail, as though rebuilding its bones might somehow rebuild the pieces of himself he had lost. He worked without speaking, yet every movement whispered something she could hear with her skin. He did not rush. He did not command. He moved beside her like a man who had finally found a rhythm softer than grief. When he glanced her way, his gaze lingered not on her scars, but on her strength. She felt heat pool beneath her ribs, not from shame or fear, but from the startling realization of being seen without demand. As days slipped into one another, Ira's voice began to return. It started as whispers in the morning, sounds she tested on the air like fragile birds uncertain of flight. She hummed when feeding the horses, spoke softly to the flowers taking root near the gate, and one evening, without realizing it, she laughed again. The sound drifted across the yard, light and warm, and the cowboy froze mid-strike. The hammer slipped from his hand, and he turned as though the laugh were a language he thought extinct. She felt her cheeks warm under his gaze, a sensation both unfamiliar and intoxicating. He did not step closer, yet the space between them thickened with unspoken meaning. He did not ask her to speak more. He never asked anything of her. Yet his presence invited her voice to grow, and she found herself answering questions he never voiced. Her laughter began to spill into nights that once terrified her, and each time their eyes met, something invisible shifted. Desire simmered in the air, not rushed or ravenous, but patient, like a flame guarding its own oxygen. His gaze traced her without claiming her, and the awareness of it made her pulse quicken in a way that frightened her for reasons she did not yet dare to explore. The cowboy found his peace not in Ira's silence, but in her presence. He repaired the house beside her, matching her breathing without knowing he was doing so, and she planted flowers that drew light into the wounds of the land. They were not healed. They were not whole. But they were held, gently and fiercely, like two souls learning there were ways to touch without breaking, ways to love without owning, and ways to stay without surrendering who they were. It was not perfection. It was something better. The sun slipped low across the horizon, staining the sky with colors too warm to be real, as though the world itself had decided to reward the ranch for surviving its own ghosts. Grace stood at the edge of the newly repaired porch, barefoot in the late breeze, her toes curling in the smooth grain of wood the cowboy had sanded by hand. The land no longer looked like a battlefield. Flowers trembled in the wind where blood once threatened to fall. The fence, once broken, now held firm. Even the house seemed to breathe differently, no longer bracing for loss but waiting for life. Ira inhaled, letting the air fill her lungs the way she once feared it never would again. Beside her stood the cowboy, tall and still in that way that always made her chest tighten, as though silence itself had weight when he carried it. He did not touch her, yet she felt him everywhere, like warmth lingering near the skin before a hand dares to claim its place. His presence did not confine her. It coaxed her forward. His gaze traced her profile, not with hunger, but with recognition, and she felt her pulse stir at the intimacy of being seen so clearly without being consumed. The memory of the auction flickered in her mind, sharp enough to sting. A stage. A chain. A price that declared she was less than the wood she stood on now. Men had looked at her like she was something to acquire, something to break or use or forget. Their eyes traveled her body without ever touching her spirit. The cowboy's eyes were different. They lingered low sometimes, yes, following the line of her hips or the curve where her shoulder met her neck, but every glance carried reverence rather than entitlement. It made her shiver in a way she had no name for, as though desire was no longer something she had to fear. His fingers brushed hers then, barely a whisper of skin, but she felt it travel up her arm like a slow-burning flame. He didn't grip her wrist or pull her close. He let her choose the space between them. She turned her hand palm up, offering it, not because she owed him anything, but because she wanted to know what it felt like to be wanted without being owned. His hand slid into hers, rough and warm, and the touch sank into her bones like a truth she had always been denied. A blush rose to her throat, unbidden, and she didn't hide it. She let it color her, let it speak in ways words never could. The ranch stretched out before them, reborn from ruin. She could hear the distant rhythm of horses, the creak of the barn settling into its new beams, the soft hush of leaves that no longer trembled with warning. The cowboy's thumb traced the inside of her wrist, slow and deliberate, and she wondered how a man known for violence could touch her as though she was something sacred. Her body leaned toward him, not in surrender, but in recognition. Every inch of her that had once been claimed by fear now felt lit from within, warmed by the possibility that someone might want her not despite her scars, but because of the strength they revealed. She turned to him fully, her voice low and sure, the words tasting like victory on her tongue. "I wasn't saved," she whispered. "I was chosen." The cowboy's breath caught, not because the words surprised him, but because they finally named what he had never dared assume. His gaze deepened, darkened, softened all at once, and in that moment she knew he had never wanted a possession. He had wanted a partner. Someone whose existence didn't shrink him but steadied him. Someone whose presence didn't silence his demons but made them unnecessary. The land around them held its breath. The porch, the flowers, even the shadows seemed to listen. Somewhere inside her chest, something settled into place, not like a chain snapping, but like a door opening. She stepped closer. His forehead dipped toward hers, as though instinct alone guided him, but she closed the remaining distance. Their breaths mingled, hot and human, and though their lips barely touched, the ache of almost was more profound than any collision. He didn't claim her mouth. He waited. And waiting, for the first time in her life, felt like being honored rather than delayed. The narrator's voice rose not as a command but as an echo of the moment, as though speaking aloud what had already embedded itself in every viewer's pulse. If someone bet everything they owned on your freedom, would you have believed you were worth it? The question didn't demand an answer. It invited truth. Claire closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the cowboy's breath settle against her lips, and every scar she had ever carried suddenly felt like a map leading here. Tell us in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe not for the story, but for the truth you just felt.